It's a story that rewrites everything we thought we knew about trust, marriage, and the unforgiving nature of the sea. What happened to Robert and Margaret Thornfield in the Pacific Ocean on a seemingly perfect morning in September would haunt marine investigators for years to come. It's a mystery that challenges the very foundation of what it means to share a life with someone, and what happens when deadly secrets meet the ocean's brutal honesty. In this story, we're going to dissect every detail of a tragedy that started not with a storm, not with equipment failure, not with human error in the traditional sense, but with a lie so calculated, so deeply buried, that it took the Pacific Ocean itself to drag it into the light. We're going to examine the evidence that the Coast Guard found, piece together the timeline that led to disaster, and reveal the shocking truth that Robert Thornfield carried to his watery grave. This is a lesson every sailor needs to understand, but more than that, it's a warning about the price of deception when your life depends on absolute trust. What happened to the Thornfields could happen to any couple who underestimate the power of secrets when they're hundreds of miles from shore, with nothing but their boat and each other standing between them and the abyss. Robert Thornfield was 54 years old, a meticulous man who wore his silver hair combed back and his khaki pants pressed to razor-sharp creases. For 30 years, he'd worked as a structural engineer for Boeing, spending his days calculating stress loads and failure points on aircraft that carried millions of passengers safely through the skies. His colleagues knew him as methodical, almost obsessively careful, the kind of man who triple-checked calculations that other engineers would sign off on without a second thought. Margaret, 52, was his perfect complement. Where Robert was all angles and calculations, she was curves and intuition. A successful real estate agent who could read people like open books, she had the kind of warm laugh that made clients feel like family, and the sharp business sense that had helped her and Robert build a comfortable life in their Bellevue home. She was petite, barely 5'3", with auburn hair she wore in a practical bob, and green eyes that lit up whenever she talked about their shared dream. That dream had been 23 years in the making. It started with a magazine photo Margaret had torn out and stuck to their refrigerator. A sleek 42-foot Catalina sailboat cutting through crystal blue water somewhere in the Caribbean. "Someday," she'd written across the bottom in her flowing handwriting. "Someday" became the refrain of their marriage, whispered over morning coffee, discussed during long walks through their neighborhood, planned and replanned through countless evenings at their kitchen table. Robert had taken the dream seriously, perhaps more seriously than Margaret had initially expected. He enrolled in sailing courses at the Seattle Yacht Club, spending weekends learning navigation, weather patterns, and seamanship. Margaret joined him, discovering a love for the water she'd never known existed. They started with day sails on Puget Sound, then week-long charters in the San Juan Islands, gradually building their skills and confidence. The plan was always the same: retire early, buy their dream boat, and spend their golden years exploring the world's most beautiful anchorages. They'd sail the Caribbean first, maybe spend a winter in the Bahamas, then head through the Panama Canal to the Pacific. The South Pacific called to them both: Tahiti, Fiji, the exotic names rolling off their tongues like poetry during their planning sessions. Robert threw himself into the preparation with the same methodical approach he brought to his engineering work. He read every sailing memoir he could find, subscribed to 3 different boating magazines, and filled binders with charts and cruising guides. He calculated provision lists, researched weather windows, and planned their route with mathematical precision. Margaret handled the business side with equal dedication. She worked extra hours, took on additional clients, and invested every spare dollar into their cruising fund. She sold her BMW and drove a reliable but modest Honda instead. They canceled their cable subscription, ate out less frequently, and turned their basement into a storage area for boat equipment they'd accumulated over the years. Their friends thought they were crazy. "You're giving up your whole life for a boat?" Margaret's sister asked during one particularly tense family dinner. But the Thornfields were undeterred. They had a vision, a shared purpose that had sustained their marriage through the ordinary challenges of middle age. By 2019, they were ready. Robert took early retirement with a generous severance package, and Margaret sold her share of the real estate firm to her business partner. They had $340,000 in cash, more than enough to buy the boat of their dreams and outfit her properly for extended cruising. They found her in San Diego, a 1995 Catalina 42 named Serendipity. The boat was exactly what they'd dreamed of. Sleek lines, a spacious cockpit, and a comfortable interior with all the amenities they'd need for long-term living aboard. The previous owner, a retired doctor named Dr. Harrison, had taken meticulous care of her. The gel coat gleamed, the teak was perfectly maintained, and every system seemed to be in perfect working order. Robert inspected every inch of the boat with an engineer's eye. He crawled through the bilge, examined the through-hull fittings, tested the electrical systems, and checked the rigging from deck to masthead. Dr. Harrison provided comprehensive maintenance records going back 15 years, showing regular haul-outs, engine services, and equipment upgrades. "She's been my baby," Dr. Harrison told them as they signed the purchase agreement. 24 years I've owned her, and she's never let me down. You folks are getting a boat that'll take you anywhere you want to go." Margaret fell in love with Serendipity's interior immediately. The main salon was bathed in natural light from the large cabin windows, and the galley was perfectly laid out for serious cooking. The master stateroom was cozy but comfortable, with enough storage for their belongings and a private head with a separate shower. They spent 3 months in San Diego outfitting Serendipity for their adventure. Robert installed new navigation electronics, upgraded the autopilot system, and added a wind vane for backup steering. They mounted solar panels, installed a water maker, and filled every storage compartment with spare parts and emergency equipment. Margaret focused on the living spaces, selecting dishes that wouldn't break in rough seas, organizing storage systems that would keep their belongings secure, and stocking the galley with non-perishable foods that would last for weeks at sea. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Every night they'd collapse into their berth, tired but happy, talking excitedly about the adventures that lay ahead. They planned their first major passage, a shakedown cruise to Mexico, where they'd spend the winter learning to live aboard before heading further south. Their departure from San Diego on October 15th, 2019, was everything they'd dreamed it would be. Margaret's sister and brother-in-law drove down from Los Angeles to see them off, and even Robert's typically reserved mother admitted she was excited for their adventure. "Call us every few days," Margaret's sister insisted, hugging her tightly at the dock, "and don't do anything too crazy out there." "We'll be fine," Margaret laughed, though Robert noticed she held the hug a few seconds longer than usual. "We've prepared for everything." Robert started the engine while Margaret handled the dock lines, their departure choreographed through months of practice. As they motored out of the harbor, the morning sun painted the water gold, and dolphins appeared alongside their bow, welcoming them to their new life. The passage to Ensenada was perfect. Light winds, calm seas, and the kind of weather that makes sailing look easy in the magazines. Margaret proved to be a natural helmsman, and Robert marveled at how quickly she adapted to reading the wind and waves. They anchored in the protected harbor just as the sun was setting, sharing a bottle of champagne and watching the lights of the town twinkle to life. "I can't believe we actually did it," Margaret said, leaning against Robert's shoulder in the cockpit. "We're really doing this." 23 years of planning," Robert replied, kissing the top of her head. "And it's even better than I imagined." They spent the winter cruising the Baja Peninsula, exploring anchorages that felt like private paradises. Margaret learned to spearfish in the clear waters around Los Cabos, while Robert perfected his celestial navigation skills. They met other cruising couples, sharing sundowners and swapping stories of life on the water. Every few days, they'd call Margaret's sister using their satellite phone, sharing updates about their location and adventures. The calls were always upbeat, filled with descriptions of spectacular sunsets, friendly local fishermen, and the simple pleasure of waking up in a different anchorage every few days. "You sound so happy," Margaret's sister told her during one call in February. "I haven't heard you laugh this much in years." "I feel like we've found what we were meant to do," Margaret replied. watching Robert adjust their solar panels on deck. Every day feels like a gift. By spring, they were ready for their next adventure. They'd heard about other cruisers heading to the Marquesas Islands in French Polynesia, and the idea captured their imagination. It would be their longest passage yet, nearly 3,000 miles of open ocean. But they felt ready. Robert spent weeks planning the passage, studying weather patterns and plotting their route. He calculated their food and water requirements down to the last gallon, and even installed a backup GPS system in case their primary navigation equipment failed. They departed La Paz, Mexico on March 20th, 2020, just as the world was shutting down due to COVID-19. In a way, the timing was perfect. They were already isolated, already living the kind of self-sufficient life that the pandemic was forcing on everyone else. The first week of the passage was textbook perfect. Steady trade winds pushed them west at a comfortable 7 knots, and the boat handled beautifully in the long Pacific swells. They fell into an easy rhythm. 4-hour watches, meals together, and long conversations during the day as they watched the endless blue horizon. Margaret proved to be an excellent navigator, taking sun sights with their sextant and comparing them to their GPS positions. Robert marveled at her attention to detail and her growing confidence in handling all aspects of sailing. "I never thought I'd be comfortable being this far from land," she admitted one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "But I feel safer with you out here than I did in Seattle traffic." "We make a good team," Robert replied, though something in his voice made Margaret glance at him curiously. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "You seem, I don't know, distracted lately." Robert forced a smile. "Just focused on getting us there safely. This is a big ocean." On their 10th day at sea, Margaret noticed something that would later haunt her dreams. She was checking their position on the chart when she noticed a small water stain on the navigation table. It was barely visible, just a slight discoloration in the wood, but it was new. "Honey, have you noticed any water in the nav station?" she asked Robert, who was adjusting their wind vane steering. "Just a little condensation," he replied without looking up. "It's normal in these humid conditions." Margaret accepted the explanation, but she made a mental note to keep an eye on it. As a real estate agent, she'd learned to trust her instincts about problems, even small ones. 2 days later, she noticed the stain was larger. "Robert, I'm worried about this water damage," she said, pointing to the navigation table. "It's definitely getting worse." This time, Robert did look, and Margaret caught something in his expression, a flash of something that looked almost like guilt. "I'll check it out," he said quickly. "Probably just a loose fitting somewhere." That night, Margaret woke up to the sound of the bilge pump running. It was a soft, whirring noise that she'd grown accustomed to during their time aboard. All boats take on some water, and the automatic bilge pump was designed to handle it. But something about the sound bothered her. She slipped out of the berth and made her way to the salon, being careful not to wake Robert. Using a small flashlight, she lifted one of the floorboards to look into the bilge. What she saw made her blood run cold. There was more water than she'd ever seen before, and it had an oily sheen that reflected her flashlight beam. But what terrified her most was what she saw floating in the water. Small pieces of fiberglass, like chips of white paint. But she knew they weren't paint. Margaret had spent enough time around boats to recognize the signs of osmotic blistering, a condition where water penetrates the hull's gel coat and begins to delaminate the fiberglass underneath. It was serious, potentially catastrophic, and it was happening to their boat right now, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Her hands shaking, she quietly replaced the floorboard and crept back to their berth. Robert was sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed in the red glow of their cabin lights. She lay there until dawn, her mind racing with questions and fears. When Robert woke up, Margaret was already in the galley making coffee. She waited until he'd had his first cup before speaking. "Robert, we need to talk about the hull." The expression that crossed Robert's face confirmed her worst fears. It wasn't surprise, it was resignation. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. Robert set down his coffee cup and looked out at the ocean. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind in the rigging and the splash of waves against their hull, their compromised hull. "Since before we left San Diego," he said finally. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "What?" "I found the first blisters during my pre-purchase survey. They were small, barely visible, but I knew what they were." Margaret stared at her husband of 28 years, trying to process what he was telling her. "You knew our boat had hull problems, and you didn't tell me?" "The surveyor said it wasn't uncommon in boats this age. He said we could manage it, maybe get a few more years." "A few more years?" Margaret's voice rose. "Robert, we're 1,000 miles from the nearest land." Robert finally looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Desperation. "I couldn't tell you," he said. "We'd already put everything into this dream. You'd sold your business, I'd retired early, we'd spent our life savings. If I'd told you about the hull problems, you would have wanted to find another boat, and we didn't have the money left to start over." Margaret felt like the world was tilting around her. Everything they'd built their new life on, their beautiful boat, their carefully laid plans, their shared adventure, was built on a lie. "So you decided to gamble with our lives instead?" "I thought we could make it to the Marquesas and fix it there. Or maybe sell the boat and fly home. I had a plan." "You had a plan." Margaret's voice was deadly quiet now. "Your plan was to take your wife into the middle of the Pacific Ocean in a boat you knew was falling apart." The argument that followed was the worst fight of their marriage. 28 years of trust and partnership seemed to evaporate in the cramped confines of their salon. Margaret accused Robert of being reckless and dishonest. Robert defended his decision, insisting he was protecting their dream, their future. "I was trying to save what we'd worked for," he pleaded. "If I'd told you, we would have lost everything, and now we might lose our lives." The fight ended with Margaret storming into the forward cabin and slamming the door. For the first time since they'd been married, they slept in separate beds. The next morning brought an eerie calm. Both of them seemed to realize that their anger was a luxury they couldn't afford. They were still hundreds of miles from land, and their boat, compromised or not, was their only way home. Margaret emerged from the forward cabin to find Robert already checking the bilge. The water level was noticeably higher than it had been the night before. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. Robert's shoulders sagged. "Bad. The blisters are spreading, and the hull is starting to weep water along a section about 8 feet long." They spent the morning trying to work out a plan. Robert calculated their pumping capacity versus their estimated water intrusion rate. Margaret plotted their position and the distance to various islands. Neither calculation was encouraging. "We need to call for help," Margaret said finally. Robert nodded reluctantly. They'd both hoped it wouldn't come to that. A Coast Guard rescue in the middle of the Pacific would mean abandoning serendipity, losing not just their investment, but their entire future as planned. But as Robert reached for the satellite phone, a new sound joined the familiar creaking of their rigging. It was a subtle change, barely audible, but Robert recognized it immediately. It was the sound of water moving inside their hull. Not the normal splash of water in the bilge, but the slosh of water moving through compromised fiberglass. "We need to get that Mayday out now," he said. Margaret grabbed the handheld VHF radio while Robert powered up their long-range SSB radio. But as she raised the VHF antenna, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Their emergency position indicating radio beacon, their EPIRB, was missing from its bracket. "Robert, where's our EPIRB?" Robert looked up from the SSB radio, following her gaze to the empty bracket. His face went white. It was there yesterday. I checked it myself." They searched the boat frantically, but the EPIRB was nowhere to be found. Somehow, their most critical piece of emergency equipment, the device that would have automatically transmitted their position to rescue services, had disappeared. As they searched, the sound of water inside the hull grew louder. Margaret lifted the floorboards again and gasped. The water level in the bilge had risen 6 inches in the past hour, and she could actually see water seeping through hairline cracks in the hull. "Robert, we're sinking!" The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Robert abandoned his search for the EPIRB and joined Margaret at the bilge. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. Multiple sections of the hull were now compromised, and water was entering faster than their pumps could remove it. "How long do we have?" Margaret asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Robert did quick mental calculations. "At this rate, maybe 6 hours before the water level reaches the electronics. After that," he didn't need to finish the sentence. They looked at each other across the flooded bilge, and Margaret saw her own thoughts reflected in Robert's eyes. They were going to die out here, alone in the vastness of the Pacific, because of a decision Robert had made in a San Diego boatyard 8 months ago. "I'm sorry," Robert whispered. "I'm so sorry." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with new resolve. "We can be sorry later. Right now, we need to focus on staying alive." The next few hours passed in a blur of desperate activity. They activated every manual bilge pump they had, taking turns working the handles until their arms ached. Margaret sent distress calls on every radio frequency they had, broadcasting their position and situation to anyone who might be listening. Their life raft was mounted on the cabin top, ready for deployment, but they both knew their chances of survival in a life raft in the middle of the Pacific were minimal. They had emergency water and provisions, but rescue could be days away, assuming anyone had even heard their distress calls. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that they were fighting a losing battle. The water in the bilge continued to rise despite their efforts, and new cracks appeared in the hull every hour. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and Serendipity's motion changed as she became heavier and less responsive. "We need to prepare the life raft," Robert said finally. They both knew he was right, but neither wanted to admit it. As they worked to ready their emergency equipment, Margaret made a discovery that would haunt investigators for years to come. While gathering important papers from the navigation station, she found a manila folder hidden behind their chart storage that she'd never seen before. Inside were documents that revealed the true extent of Robert's deception. There were surveyors' reports dating back to their original purchase, showing extensive hull damage that would have cost nearly $50,000 to repair properly. There were emails from marine surveyors, insurance companies, and boatyards, all discussing the severity of Serendipity's problems. Most shocking of all was a letter from Dr. Harrison, the previous owner, dated 3 days after their purchase. In it, he confessed that he'd known about the hull problems, but had covered them up for the sale. He offered to take the boat back and refund their money, but the letter had never been shown to Margaret. Robert had hidden all of it, choosing instead to gamble their lives on a deteriorating hull and his own stubborn optimism. "You knew," Margaret said, holding up the folder. "You knew everything." Robert couldn't meet her eyes. "I thought we could make it work." "Make it work?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Robert, we're about to die because you couldn't face the truth." As if summoned by her words, a new sound joined the symphony of their sinking boat, the low rumble of their engine room flooding. Water had reached the engine, and their electrical systems would be next. They had perhaps an hour before Serendipity would be uninhabitable. Working together despite their anger and fear, they deployed their life raft just as the sun was setting. The bright orange raft inflated properly, floating alongside their dying boat like a life preserver thrown to drowning swimmers. Margaret gathered their emergency supplies while Robert made final attempts to contact the Coast Guard. Their SSB radio was still working, powered by the boat's battery bank that sat high in the bilge. But for how much longer? "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Robert broadcast into the gathering darkness. "This is sailing vessel Serendipity. Position 18 degrees 45 minutes north, 142 degrees 30 minutes west. We are abandoning ship due to hull failure. 2 persons on board, deploying to life raft. Please relay to Coast Guard." He repeated the message 3 times, then shut off the radio to preserve battery power. Whether anyone had heard them was impossible to know. As they prepared to abandon the boat that had been their home and their dream, Margaret made one final discovery. While gathering personal items from their cabin, she found their missing EPIRB. It was in Robert's toolbox, deliberately disabled. The activation pins had been removed, and the battery had been disconnected. "You sabotaged our EPIRB," she said. holding up the disabled beacon. Robert looked at the device in her hands, and for the first time since their ordeal began, he seemed to break completely. "I couldn't let them find us too quickly," he sobbed. "I thought if we could just get to the Marquesas, if we could just make it work somehow." The full scope of Robert's deception was now clear. He hadn't just hidden the boat's problems. He'd actively sabotaged their safety equipment to prevent rescue until his desperate plan could somehow succeed. Margaret stared at her husband of 28 years and realized she was looking at a stranger. The methodical, careful engineer she'd married had become something else entirely, a man so desperate to avoid admitting failure that he'd been willing to kill them both. "Get in the raft," she said quietly. They abandoned Serendipity just as she began her final death spiral. The boat that had been their dream, their home and their future, disappeared beneath the Pacific swells within minutes of their departure, taking with her the evidence of Robert's deception and the 23 years of planning that had led to this moment. In the life raft, surrounded by the vast darkness of the Pacific night, Margaret and Robert faced the stark reality of their situation. They had emergency water for perhaps 10 days, food for a week, and no working emergency beacon to guide rescuers to their location. Their only hope was that someone had heard Robert's final Mayday call and that search and rescue aircraft would be able to find their tiny orange raft in the immensity of the ocean. But Margaret knew their real enemy wasn't the sea or the distance to land. It was the lies that had brought them here. Robert's inability to face the truth had destroyed not just their boat and their future, but the trust that had sustained their marriage for nearly 3 decades. As she looked at her husband huddled in the opposite corner of the life raft, Margaret realized that even if they were rescued, their marriage was as irretrievably lost as Serendipity herself. The 3rd day in the life raft brought the psychological breakdown that Margaret had been dreading. Robert, consumed by guilt and the magnitude of what his deception had cost them, began talking to himself, muttering calculations and apologies to the empty ocean. "I can fix this," he kept repeating. "I can make this right." But there was nothing left to fix. Their water supply was running low, their emergency rations were nearly exhausted, and no rescue aircraft had appeared on the horizon. Margaret tried to maintain hope, but she could feel her own strength failing. The constant motion of the raft, the sun's brutal heat during the day, and the cold dampness at night were taking their toll. She found herself thinking about their comfortable home in Bellevue, wondering who would find their bodies, wondering if anyone would ever know the truth about what had happened. On the 4th day, Robert made a confession that completed the picture of his deception. "The insurance," he whispered. "I let the hull coverage lapse." Margaret turned to look at him, too exhausted to feel anger anymore. "What?" "The insurance company wanted a new survey before renewing the hull coverage. They were suspicious about the osmotic blistering. So I let it lapse and told you it was still active." Even in her weakened state, Margaret understood what this meant. Not only had Robert gambled their lives on a compromised boat, but he'd also ensured that even if they'd made it to the Marquesas safely, they would have had no way to repair or replace Serendipity. "You destroyed everything," she said quietly. Robert nodded, tears streaming down his sunburned face. "I know." They drifted in silence for the rest of the day. Two people who had shared a life for nearly 3 decades, now as far apart as strangers. That night, Margaret woke to find Robert gone. She searched the raft frantically, calling his name into the darkness, but she knew what had happened. Unable to live with the consequences of his deception, Robert had slipped quietly over the side sometime during the night, choosing the ocean's embrace over facing the reality of what he'd done. Margaret spent the next day alone, talking to herself to maintain her sanity, rationing her remaining water, and waiting for either rescue or death. She thought about their early years together, about the dreams they'd shared, about the man Robert had been before desperation had turned him into someone she didn't recognize. On the 6th day, just as Margaret was beginning to hallucinate from dehydration, she heard the sound that she'd been praying for, the drone of aircraft engines. The Coast Guard Hercules C-130 spotted her orange life raft from 12 miles away and within hours she was aboard a cutter, wrapped in blankets and receiving medical attention. The investigation that followed Margaret's rescue revealed the full scope of Robert's deception. Coast Guard investigators examined the evidence Margaret had saved from serendipity, the surveyor's reports, the insurance documents, the disabled EPIRB. They interviewed Dr. Harrison, who confirmed that he'd known about the boat's problems and had tried to make amends after the sale. They spoke with the marine surveyor who'd first identified the osmotic blistering, who said he'd explicitly told Robert that the boat was unsuitable for offshore sailing without major repairs. The official report concluded that Robert Thornfield had knowingly taken his wife to sea in an unseaworthy vessel, sabotaged their emergency equipment, and fraudulently misrepresented their insurance coverage. His actions directly led to the loss of their vessel and his own death. But for Margaret, the investigation's findings were secondary to a more personal reckoning. As she sat in her sister's living room in Los Angeles, recovering from her ordeal, she struggled to understand how the man she'd loved and trusted for nearly 3 decades could have made such catastrophic choices. He was so desperate to make the dream work that he lost sight of everything else, she told the psychiatrist the Coast Guard had recommended. He couldn't face the idea of disappointing me, of admitting that our plan wasn't going to work. So he decided to gamble everything, our savings, our future, our lives, on hope and luck. The psychiatrist nodded. It's not uncommon in cases of financial or professional failure. The shame becomes so overwhelming that people will take enormous risks to avoid confronting it. But I would have understood, Margaret said, tears flowing freely for the first time since her rescue. We could have found another way. We could have bought a different boat, or modified our plans, or even given up sailing altogether. I would have been disappointed, but I would have gotten over it. Would Robert have believed that? Margaret considered the question carefully. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe he knew me better than I knew myself. Maybe he was right that I would have blamed him for destroying our dream. Does it matter now? Margaret looked out the window at the busy Los Angeles street, thinking about the vast Pacific where Robert's body still drifted somewhere in the blue depths. I guess not. But I keep thinking, if he'd just been honest, we'd both be alive. We might not have our dream boat, we might not be sailing around the world, but we'd be alive. The truth about Robert's deception became public when Margaret decided to share her story with a sailing magazine, hoping to warn other couples about the dangers of keeping secrets that could affect their safety. The article, titled "When Dreams Become Deadly," became one of the most read pieces in the magazine's history. Letters poured in from sailors around the world, many sharing their own stories of hidden problems, covered-up failures, and the pressure to maintain the facade of the perfect cruising life. Margaret realized that Robert's fatal flaw, his inability to face disappointing realities, was more common than anyone wanted to admit. The sailing community likes to present itself as competent and self-reliant, one letter writer confided. But there's enormous pressure to live up to that image. Admitting that your boat has problems, or that you're not as experienced as you pretend to be, feels like admitting failure as a sailor and as a person. Margaret began speaking at boat shows and sailing seminars, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the importance of honesty and partnerships where lives depend on trust. She always ended her presentations with the same message. The ocean doesn't care about your pride, your dreams, or your financial investments. It only cares about the truth, and the truth is that no dream, no matter how beautiful, is worth dying for. She never sailed again. The story of Robert and Margaret Thornfield became a legend in the sailing community, passed down as a warning about the deadly consequences of deception at sea. Marine surveyors began using it as an example of why buyers should always insist on seeing all documentation about a boat's condition. Insurance companies cited it when explaining why hull coverage requires accurate disclosure of known problems. But for Margaret, living quietly in a small apartment in Seattle, the story was simpler and more personal. It was about a man who loved his wife so much that he couldn't bear to disappoint her, and who loved their shared dream so deeply that he convinced himself lies could make it come true. People ask me if I'm angry at Robert, she told a documentary crew that interviewed her 5 years after the tragedy. And the honest answer is yes, I am. I'm angry that he didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. I'm angry that he thought our dream was more important than our lives. I'm angry that he left me alone in that life raft to face the consequences of his choices. She paused, looking out at the Seattle waterfront where sailboats moved peacefully across Elliott Bay. But I'm also heartbroken for him. He was trapped by his own inability to face failure, and that trap killed him just as surely as the ocean did. He wasn't a bad man. He was a desperate man who made increasingly desperate choices until there was no way out. The interviewer asked if she had any regrets about their sailing adventure. I regret that Robert couldn't be honest with me. I regret that we didn't have the kind of marriage where he felt safe telling me about his fears and failures. But I don't regret trying to follow our dream. Dreams aren't the problem. Lies are the problem. In the end, the story of the Thornfields became a parable about more than just sailing. It was about the corrosive power of secrets in relationships, about the difference between protecting someone and deceiving them, and about the ultimate futility of trying to build a life on anything other than truth. The ocean that took Robert Thornfield's life also revealed his deepest secret, proving once again that the sea is the ultimate arbiter of truth. In its vast indifference, it strips away all pretense and forces sailors to confront reality in its most unforgiving form. For Margaret Thornfield, that reality was the knowledge that the man she'd loved and trusted for 28 years had been willing to gamble both their lives rather than admit he'd made a mistake. It was a truth more devastating than any storm, more final than any shipwreck, and it was a truth that only the ocean's brutal honesty could have revealed.